All right. So I'll sing the prayer. First two lines of the prayer are expressing our reliance on the Buddha. Those of us who think we're Buddhists already, reminding us about reiterating our reliance on the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And the second two lines are expressing that thought, those thoughts, that aspiration. Sangye charang soke chognam la janshu baru jagni kyapsuchi jagi chonyen gi personam ki rola penche sangye drupa shog sangye charang soke chognam la janshu baru jagni kyapsuchi jagi chonyen gi personam ki rola penche sangye drupa shog Sangye chadang soke chognam la Jangcho baju jagni kyapsuchi Dagi chonyen gi personam ki Drola penche sangye drupa shog. Okay. So the question is, why courageous? That's a crucial point. The word I use very purposely. Why courageous compassion? Because it's sometimes, so I think the key is to understand what Buddhism means by compassion, especially the Mahayana path. And then it makes sense why courageous. Because we tend to have compassion, and that's the thing, I think the view we tend to have compassion, the usual view is if we compare with the with this view, it's very limited, you know, and we're going to discuss that. Okay. Hello, everybody. Happy to see you all. Gallery. I don't want to look at myself. That's better. Now I can. So if I have the sound, here, that's no good at all. You don't want me twice. Okay, I'm going to see you all. There I am in the second picture. The first one is the top right there, isn't it? Okay, happy to see you all, everybody. Happy to see you. And then all the people here. You can see them. You can't see them, can you? Here they are. There they all are. Okay. Good. Wonderful. All right. Okay. So I'll be looking a bit in the distance, and I'll every now and again look at you guys. I can't have both. Okay. So compassion. In the Buddhist view, the definition of compassion is it's this starts with a thought. You can conceptualize it. It's the thought, when you see suffering, you have this wish, may you not suffer. So I think we'd call that also, the Buddhist view would also call that empathy. I think in some psychological views, they consider empathy to be different. But in the Buddhist view, empathy, compassion, pretty much the same. You know, there's levels of it, of course, but you see suffering and your heart reaches out, you know. And it's like, oh my God, look at that suffering. And I wish they didn't suffer. May you not suffer. That's compassion. So it's very clear, isn't it, then? If you're going to have compassion, you need to know what suffering is. So this is the limitation. This is the view, I think this is where the really quite radical difference between the Mahayana Buddhist view of what we're capable of, the levels of compassion we need to cultivate in the long term, and the view we tend to have. So the view we tend to have is because of our definition of suffering. So what we mean by suffering pretty much is when the bad things happen. Think of it simply. In your own life, if you hurt your knee, you'd say that's suffering, a mild level, but that's suffering. You know, if your husband abuses you, if your wife leaves you, if, you know, war, you know, you look at the levels, there's levels of suffering. And usually it's when the bad things happen, And there's nothing wrong with that. So for the Buddha, in order to get clear what he means by suffering, we've got to go back. Okay, there's a framework here. If you're familiar with the Tibetan Buddhist packaging of the teachings, this Lam Rim, then the compassion teachings are the more advanced ones. They're the most advanced level, which often is surprising to us because we usually think of a spiritual path as being about compassion. But from the Buddhist point of view, that's the more advanced level. The first level is, so there's this analogy I use all the time that is a good way of framing this packaging, and that's the bird needs two wings, wisdom and compassion. So the wisdom wing is the first two levels of the practice that are the prerequisites for preparing you to really be compassionate, to really have compassion. So in a sense, using our terminology, the wisdom wing is about you developing self-compassion, not in the way we think. Very, very different, and I'll explain. I mean, nothing wrong with having a weep and a cry and a massage and a good sleep and a hug from a friend, self-compassion. But there's much more specific meaning in Buddhism, and they would not use the term self-compassion. It's only by definition other people. But that's a term we use, I think, a lot in our culture, isn't it? So the wisdom wing is a prerequisite. And in a sense, what it is the work you do on yourself with all the nuts and bolts. Why does it keep coming back to the picture showing me? I wonder. You've got all the people up there, right? Well, you've got me up there. What is it? The people. And the friends. I beg your pardon? I can't hear you. Where are the people? You need to have the people. They're part of the teaching, Dundra. I'm not showing my compassion, am I? They're here at the teaching, Dundra. People have to see each other. This is the way the world is now. We have this weird way of having screens. We have to show it. People don't like. You don't have to look at it. And you don't like looking at me either. You can close your eyes. But I want the gallery on my screen. Because this makes it more intimate, Dundra. You know yourself when you do Zoom. If I can see the people here, they feel like I'm talking to them as well, rather than just looking at the moon or something. They're up there now? Good, okay. Thank you. All right. So the wisdom wing is all the work you need to do. So nuts and bolts of Buddha's teachings, basically. You learn about karma, you learn about you learn about your mind, you learn to work on yourself. And this is the thing about suffering. And so in order to understand compassion, which is may you not suffer, we need to know what suffering is. So to know about what suffering is, we have to go back to the wisdom wing. We have to go back to the nuts and bolts of the basic teachings of the Buddha. And this brings us to the Four Noble Truths, which is not in the compassion wing. It assumes you've already done that when you get to the compassion wing, when you get to this understanding of compassion for others in the way Buddha's describing. So in the Four Noble Truths, which is what you get on the wisdom wing, is Buddha's first teaching. He taught after he got enlightened, he then, walked whatever it was, weeks, takes weeks, whatever, a few hundred miles to Varanasi, where he went to Deer Park, where when he had studied years before with his older students when he was still in the Hindu tradition. And he met his old disciples there and he gave his first teaching. And, it's known as the Four Noble Truths. Well, actually it's the four truths, I think, for the noble ones. The truths aren't themselves noble, I don't think. I think it's referring to the truths for the noble ones, those who realized it. So this is what we learn about what suffering is. And if you want to understand Buddha's view of compassion, you need to understand this. So there's three levels of suffering. The first noble truth is there is suffering. The second is there are causes. The third is you can get rid of both the suffering and the causes. And the fourth is the methodology, how to do it. In other words, it's the essence of the Buddha's teachings on how because he's talking to you, how you get rid of your suffering and its causes. That's the Buddha's teachings, basically, all about karma and the mind. And that's the nuts and bolts of the wisdom wing. That's the nuts and bolts of the first and second scopes, if you like, of this Lam room packaging. And they're necessarily the prerequisites for being ready to have this unbelievable levels of compassion for all sentient beings, not just those who are having a hard time. Now that's the part that's important to us. So then you think, well, you mean that includes the harmers, that includes the pedophiles, that includes the warmongers, that includes, the terrorists? And the answer is yes. And so then what about all the happy people? Does it include them? Yes. So this is the part that's shocking. And if you don't know that, then when you hear that in the compassion wing, the Buddha says you should have compassion for all sentient beings, it doesn't make sense. So you need to have a basic understanding of the Four Noble Truths, where that is laid out very clearly about how all sentient beings are suffering at one degree or another. So we've all got the first kind of suffering. Everybody has some kind of suffering like that when the bad things happen. Then you've got the second kind of suffering, and that's the part that we don't think that way in our modern, certainly in our usual views of the world. So in other words, if you have a person who's having a hard time in their relationship and their partner's beating them up, and you have another couple who adore each other and are really kind and loving, you would only think the first group is suffering, and you would never think the second couple is suffering. But from the Buddhist perspective, they're actually suffering at a subtler level. And this is the part that we don't like to hear, because it sounds kind of rather forbidding, You mean I'm not even allowed to have a nice time with my husband? I'm actually suffering. And that's why we have to understand what Buddha means by suffering and the causes. So the key is the causes. So the first level of suffering, and even to have the view the Buddha has, those who have got the bad things happening, which is the first kind of suffering, he calls it the suffering of suffering. We have to know the causes of it. And this part is very shocking for us, because the basis for our ability to have compassion for a person who's suffering, it usually, when we think of the causes of suffering, if you see a person being punched in the nose by their partner, then you have compassion for the partner, but you absolutely do not have compassion for the person who's doing the punching, because you think they are the cause of the suffering. When you see poor people, we tend to think it's all the rich people who are the cause of suffering. When you think of victims in a war, you think of Mr. Putin who's doing the war. So the view we tend to have of why there is suffering, we understand about suffering, the bad things happening, even just that level. But when we think of the causes, we think of there's a person who's doing it to them, And then if they cause it themselves, like if you, got angry and kind of punched the wall and hurt your fist, you wouldn't have compassion for that person. They deserve it. Look at them. So in other words, another way of putting it rather brutally, we only have compassion for innocent victims. So if you and I are fighting and we punch each other, the person looking on will have compassion for neither of us, because they'll say, well, they both deserve each other. Look at them. So our view of compassion, and we don't spell it out like this, is actually only for victims, and they need to be innocent. And it sounds quite brutal putting it this way, but if we analyze it, it's like that. That's why we tend to mainly have compassion now, I'm being a bit sarcastic, for a few children and a few animals. Well, most children, as long as they're not too mean, and a few animals, because we assume they are victims. So the Buddha's view it's really, really limited. So it takes a while to hear the Buddha's view if you want to understand the Four Noble Truths, to begin to understand. And this is the point: the Four Noble Truths, Buddha's talking to you. He's not talking to your husband. I wish my husband was here. He needs this. No, he's talking to us. This is where we learn to develop the self-compassion using the terminology we use, but it doesn't sound like it. It sounds rather punitive. So, okay, the second noble truth, and we'll even just look now. Let's look at the first kind of suffering only, which is the suffering of suffering, which is basically when the bad things happen. That's a simple way of putting it. So now let's look at the causes, and this is the part that's shocking to us. Quite hard for us in the West to get this, The Buddha would say, okay, so as far as the Buddha is concerned, the law of cause and effect is what runs the universe, and it's something we all understand. We're all good scientists. We get that. We know very well if you want a flower, you need to know the causes of a flower. And when you have that down, you'll get a good flower. Everything that exists, like a good computer, a cloth, a table, there is a table, and then there are causes of it. We get that. It's very practical. Well, Buddha's main deal is not tables and computers and cloths. It's happiness and suffering. In one way of actually framing all of Buddha's teachings, and this is the point about the Four Noble Truths, it's in terms of suffering and how to get rid of it. Well, if you flip that over, it's how to get happiness, isn't it? I mean, the freedom from suffering equals happiness, which again makes us, it sort of sounds rather abstract and rather kind of passive, free from suffering, but that's how he talks. So we need to understand them, the wisdom wing, in order to first understand our own suffering. And this is the key point. His Holiness has said that compassion, you could argue, it's the point of the entire path. But it's not enough. You've got to have wisdom. And wisdom is not some kind of grand thing in these terms. It's learning the nuts and bolts, as far as Buddha is concerned, of what life is all about, why there is suffering and why there is happiness, how to get happiness and how to stop suffering. That's really Buddha's expertise, So his expertise is the causes of suffering. And obviously, yourself, if you know the causes of a problem, then you can find the solution. So if you can't first identify the problem, which is the first kind of suffering, and you can't identify the causes, which is the second one, then you won't have the means to solve the problem. So you've got to know what the problem is, and you've got to know the causes. Then you can stop the problem. That's very much what's happening here in the Four Noble Truths. So, okay, think of just ordinary life and bad things happening, person's mean to you, something as simple as can be. And it's the same principle for the most intense levels and the most mild. And actually, it also refers to happiness. It's exactly the same. But because Buddha talks about all the time suffering and its causes, which is the bad things, we get a little bit addicted to hearing only the bad things. I've never yet, and I always joke about this, and it's true, I've never yet met a person who asks the question, why do good things happen? We only tend to ask, why do bad things happen? There's interesting kind of explanation for that. So, but the answers are the same. So as far as Buddha is concerned, let's just say there's this first kind of suffering, which is called the suffering of suffering, which is when the bad things happen. So now let's look at the second noble truth, and this is Buddha's explanation of the causes of it. So let's just remind ourselves of where this information comes from, which is really appropriate to ask. Well, who says, where does this information come from? Well, it comes from Buddha, but how? From Buddha's own experience. Like, again, always quote this repeatedly, but it's a really powerful point. I remember a person years ago, who happened to be in New Zealand, Nelson, New Zealand, and he happened to be a scientist who asked the question, and it's the only time I've ever heard this question. It's really fascinating. He said, who revealed these teachings to the Buddha? And this is quite a massive point, actually, if we want to try and understand Buddhism and Buddha and which means where does this information come from? Because we have the views of religion in our world, certainly it's creative religions, isn't it? The big religions, the Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. They at least share the concept that there's a creator who makes the world and makes me, and who has the power to punish and reward, pretty simply, which is fairly reasonable. I quote these things a lot, but I find these are so important. We really want to get underneath what Buddha's talking about, because I think why we have a difficulty with his explanation of suffering and its causes, which includes karma. It's difficult for us because we bring our view of punishment and reward into Buddhism and simply think it's a variation of that. But in Buddhism, it's really, the difference is quite powerful insofar as he does not posit a creator. In fact, he disagrees with it. It's part of his philosophy. It's where he diverged from the Hindu tradition. There's no such concept in Buddhism of a creator. Therefore, there's no such concept of punishment and reward, because punishment and reward implies a punisher and a rewarder. And that seems to be, I think, in our own mind, whether you're taught it or not, it's quite an instinctive view we have of punishment and reward. It's quite instinctive, and Buddha would say it's a mistake of ego. And even in a materialist world, it's the same. As far as we're concerned, mummy and daddy are our creator. And so, of course, that's why we blame them. Well, mummies mostly get the blame, I think, for why I'm suffering, And it's reasonable. If your mother made you, and I always joke about this, and nobody ever laughs, but I think it's hilariously funny. And it sounds like ridiculous almost. But if it really is true, and this is an important way to bring ourselves into hearing Buddha properly, actually. If it really is true, if your mother and father are literally your creator, and that is the view we have in the West, isn't it? They had sex, or other things now, like Petri dishes are involved, but there's the egg and the sperm involved. And so obviously you're the product of mother and father. So if you turn out to be some psychopath or a saint, you tend to be the parents of the cause, which is reasonable. My feeling is it's correct to assume that if you think your mother and father created you, then they did in fact create you. But somehow you go to your therapist and you're mad at your mum and she'll tell you shouldn't be mad at your mum, you should forgive her. Well, I disagree. Because if he did make you, and she, if your mother and your father decide to make you and you turn out to be some wacko, then they are the blame. Who else can you blame? They're the source. Like Frankenstein, wasn't Frankenstein made a monster? You can't blame the poor monster. You've got to blame Frankenstein. This is a serious point for me. But we don't question it so deeply, I think. So, of course, you can't blame God. Some people do. Italians do, apparently. Italian man got upset with it. But they have these outrageous ways of blaming God, Really, I remember Lama was in Italy visiting his friend, one of the Geshe there, and he was in hospital. The Geshe was in the hospital, and one of the Italian boys was translating what all the Italian men in the ward were saying about God, and they got worse things to say about the mother of God too. Even worse, I think she's a whore. God is a pig. I was a Catholic, and we never said a word about God. You would never say a word. We're Irish Catholic, Irish, I think, or English. Never. Or French as well, but not Italian, I tell you. And then one Argentinian fellow said, oh, we're even worse than the Italians. So some people do blame God. And in a way, I'm not being rude, but it's sort of logical. If someone made you, I don't know why you can't blame the creator. I'm not trying to be controversial here. I'm really not. If you make a car and it doesn't work, then you can't blame the car. You have to blame Mr. Toyota. You can't blame the monster. You have to blame the creator of it, which is Frankenstein. It seems logical to me. Of course, Christians have an explanation. That's okay. I have nothing wrong. But the Buddha's view is nobody made you. In fact, as His Holiness says, the law of karma, and we're going to go into this because this is one of the first causes of why we're happy and suffer. It means he calls it self-creation. He says you can call it self-creation. And this is the fundamental in Buddhism. And without understanding this in the Four Noble Truths for yourself, to explain to yourself why you're suffering, it is not possible to have compassion for others in the way Buddha is describing. But this is the hardest part for us in the modern world. We don't like the view of karma at all. We hear it in a very kind of ugly way. Because so our ego, the irony of ego is where we want to be an innocent victim. We have to be an innocent victim. And you look at our lives, we do everything in our power to get off the hook. It's very instinctive. We can't bear being blamed. Even when we did do something wrong, we can't bear taking responsibility. It's very instinctive, you know. So to think that in the view of karma, and this is the second noble truth as far as Buddha is concerned, in his law of cause and effect. I didn't answer. I got into the man in Nelson. I wandered off. Yeah, that's right. I wandered off. He asked the question, I told you that, who revealed the teachings of the Buddha? Well, I answered by saying, would you ask Einstein who revealed the teachings about relativity to him? Of course, he and everybody else laughed. But this is the point I'm trying to get to here. And this is the Buddhist point. This is the Buddhist point. Einstein we know he didn't have a vision of God telling him something. He wasn't under a tree and he had a vision. He didn't have a dream of it. It wasn't revelation, in other words. But that is the view and the assumption we have of religion, that it's necessarily beyond the world, it's from on high, meaning from a creator or some such being, and it's revelation. That's the part that was quite shocking, you know. Buddha, there's no view like that. He's more like Einstein than like Jesus in this sense. And of course, we don't think of it like this, but we need to unpack it like this if we want to understand Buddha's teaching. If we want to, no one says we have to. So that means we know very well when Einstein gets up there and talks about equals mc squared, we just know it's implied that he's done his homework. And how has he discovered that E equals mc squared? By observing, by using his noggin and observing the way the world works. Is that not what a botanist is? Is that not what a mathematician is? Is that not what a cook or a carpenter or anybody is, who've used their intelligence, observed the laws of music, observed the laws of botany, observed the laws of whatever it is, and then come up with laws, check them, and then prove them, and then codify them? Is that not what we mean by science? That is Buddha's view. And his view of causes of suffering, and indeed of course of happiness, there are two main ones, and this is the second noble truth. There are hundreds of causes that have to come together. We know that, to produce a tree or a computer. Hundreds, thousands. And there are hundreds of causes that have to come together to produce that moment of suffering. When my boyfriend punches me in the nose, let's say. But Buddha narrows it down to two causes, two main ones. And the shocking part for us is those two main causes of my suffering at the hands of my boyfriend's punch are in me, not the boyfriend. So Buddha's not saying the boyfriend's punch definitely is not one of the causes of my suffering. And there are many others as well that are out there. But they are, as far as the Buddha is concerned, they are merely catalysts for the suffering. And so the Buddha being equally, my boyfriend being kind to me, that action, as far as we are concerned, is the main cause of my happiness. And his punching me in the nose, as far as we are concerned, is the main cause of my suffering. That's why we have compassion for the child, who did that to the child? And then that's the cause of their suffering, the father that beat them. And equally, a child who's got a nice parent, who's the main cause of their happiness? Their kind parents. So we see it in that way, and that's not Buddha's view. So where did this information come from? Like Einstein, his observation. So clearly, If you talk about the view of karma, which implies a consciousness which is not physical, which implies a continuity of consciousness coming from past lives, this is all just a given in Buddhism. It's a fundamental component in Buddha's view of the universe. But consciousness is not physical. It is not a function of the brain. It is not the handiwork of a mother or father or a creator. And consciousness, and also it doesn't just come out of nowhere. So the fundamental teaching in Buddhism, is this law of karma, the law of cause and effect, that plays out in all the different beings of the universe. And it plays out in the mind or the consciousness of the sentient being, such that every millisecond of what we think and do and say, so they use the analogy of seeds, sows seeds in our mind. And a seed necessarily, when eventually it's given the appropriate conditions, will ripen in the future as an experience, as either happiness or suffering. And one way of saying is that you've got two choices, happiness or suffering. Bottom line. So as far as Buddha is concerned, there are trillions of consciousnesses, of mind streams. They don't come from mummy or daddy. They're not physical. They're not a function of the brain, which doesn't mean the brain doesn't play a role. Without insulting neuroscientists, you could say that the brain is a physical indicator of what's happening in our mind, certainly at a gross level. But the Buddha would assert much subtler levels of mind, which is why he can, through his own subtle level of mind, has been able to observe this law playing out in the minds and lives of sentient beings. And indeed, one of the main causes of suffering now is causes we've created in the past, before this life, which will ripen in this life, and the things we do in this life will ripen in a future life. This is fundamental in Buddhism. This view of consciousness not being physical, not the handiwork of a creator, not the handiwork of mummy and daddy, and not coming from nowhere. This is a fundamental point. So the point is, in Buddhist philosophy, this is all there. And actually, the whole of Buddhism would collapse into a heap of absurdity if we could prove that this point that Buddha is saying is actually mistaken. So that the only way to approach it then is not just as revelation, some nice idea that we've made up, and you merely believe in it. But we take it as a hypothesis, like any decent scientist would. Because all the teachings in Buddhism about karma, about reincarnation, about happiness, about suffering, about compassion are all rooted in this view. This is the kind of bigger picture, you know. So we don't have to like it. We don't even have to think about it. And it wouldn't necessarily prevent us from having compassion for a person, or even, you see a child who's suffering and you see the father who's also suffering, harming the child. You could even be able to have compassion for both of them. That's not impossible. You don't have to know about past lives to see that. But this bigger picture in Buddhism is informing all of these teachings of the Buddha, as I said, from the big picture point of view. So, okay, and the second noble truth, and this is for one's own practice first, there are two main causes of this moment of suffering of mind. The catalyst, one of the causes, yes, but merely like a secondary cause, not the main one. That's the major point. And this is the part that's hard for all people, Buddhist, Western, or anybody. It's hugely difficult practice to have this view that whatever's happening to me, the main cause of it is a past action of my own, such that it's left seeds in my mind that are now ripening as one of those fruits of my own suffering, or indeed my happiness. Every millisecond, the Buddha says, of anything that good happens to me, that's the fruit of a past virtue. Every millisecond of anything that bad happens to me, that's the result of some negative action. And this view is very kind of clinical, really. Like if you eat too much sugar, you could get diabetes. You don't think of it as blame. You don't think of it as reward or blame. You don't think anyone's punishing you with diabetes. You know the cause is in yourself, because maybe you're even unaware that too much sugar would cause you diabetes. You don't think of it as blame. But when it comes to religion, when it comes to morality, we think of it as blame, So karma is a hard one for materialist people, for the West, I'd say, for us modern people. But from the Buddhist point of view, it's one of the most powerful teachings and a powerful way to practice, because it enables us, if we start to practice it, to start to take responsibility instead of being an innocent victim. Without being mean, ego, Lama Yeshe would call it the self-pity me. It's got a very powerful kind of energy of wanting to be innocent, feeling that things happen to me. I'm an innocent victim. We even say it. I didn't ask to get born. It's not my fault. Ego feels that very strongly. And like I say, you don't blame your Catholic mother or your Jewish mother for that. It's a function of ego grasping, these delusions in our mind. So starting to have the view of karma, this cause and effect one, which really takes time, is a very different way to frame your own life, to interpret what's happening to you. And it can bring a lot of courage and confidence and empowerment, because you stop feeling like a victim. You know there are causes for every moment of anything that happens to you. It's a bigger picture one. It's very interesting. So this, even before we go further to the subtler levels of suffering, even now having this view for oneself to explain why I'm suffering, or indeed why I'm happy, this now informs our ability to have compassion. So then, because you take the view that all the 6 billion humans, forget all the animals, they're all the same law. But all us humans in this moment in time, meeting each other, bumping into each other, having this mummy, this daddy, these friends, these enemies, it's not just out of the blue. It's not just a random event. There's logic to all of this from the Buddhist point of view, There's nothing, because karma is a natural law, not Buddha's law, not like equivalent to God's law. It's a natural law. Then it has to be coherent. It can't just be actions. Things can't be random. I think that's one of the big things in our lives. We know there are causes of flowers and things. We're brilliant at science, but we really haven't got a clue when it comes to happiness and suffering. Why do bad things happen? Why Hitler? Why Mother Teresa? Why this? Why? It seems random. If we take the view you come from your mother and father or a creator, but certainly don't have a view of past lives, because the karmic one really is based in the view of continuity of consciousness. And it's a fundamental part. It's studied in depth. It's in the literature in depth. It's there for us to study if we wanted. So experientially, it's very powerful, because for yourself, you start to take responsibility and realize that your happiness and your suffering are in your hands. You don't sort of wait for someone else to give you something nice. You don't wait. You don't try. In other words, the way we are now, we tend to think, well, I didn't ask to get born. I'm plonked on this planet. And you kind of hope for happiness. You hope to meet the nice people, the nice events, and we spend our lives trying to get the nice people and the nice events and the nice job, believing that then I'll get happiness, and trying to avoid the ugly things. And we can all see, no matter how hard we try, we can't seem to avoid bad things happening, and we can't seem to hold on to the good things happening. We can see that no matter how hard we try. So the Buddha's emphasis is to know your own mind, to have this view of karma, it enables you to become more powerful, more kind of less victim, more in charge. And just like learning botany, if you know you want a garden, you need to learn the law called botany. And then when you have the law of botany, it explains why what is there, but and not just, oh, aren't I a bad person? Look at all the weeds. No, you know now why there are weeds and why there are flowers. You know how to interpret them, and now you know what to do to get the garden you want. You know how to produce the life you want. So this is really the basic way of framing this in Buddha's teachings is the basic ethics. Why the very starting point in Buddhism is don't kill, don't steal, don't jump on the wrong partner, don't badmouth. A little list of 10 recommendations from the Buddha as a starting point. And why is because you are the cause of your happiness and suffering. So if you don't want future suffering, like your doctor will give you a list of 10 things, don't eat sugar, don't smoke cigarettes, don't do this, don't eat too much that. You don't go, well, how dare you say that to me? You mean you're going to punish me with diabetes? No, your kind doctor, based on their own observation, is giving you a list of how to have self-compassion, basically. So the Buddha's view of ethics, where he exhorts us to not kill, steal, or lie, isn't the same as the Christian one, and this is perfectly reasonable. I asked my Catholic priest friend, what makes something a sin? So Jesus says don't kill. Why not, Jesus? Because God said. That's what defines a sin, going against God's will. And we bring that view instinctively into the Buddha's teachings. It's got nothing to do with Buddha. Your doctor doesn't say don't smoke because she says so. She's not Stalin. She says don't smoke out of kindness. So Buddha says the same thing. Don't kill, Robina. There is a view of compassion there, but that's not coming yet. It's compassion for yourself. because your killing leaves imprints in your mind that will ripen as your future suffering. Your lying will ripen as your future suffering. Your harming others ripens as your future suffering. This is the one I think even as practicing Buddhists we miss, you know. So it's quite a powerful concept that we are the creators of our own happiness and suffering. So when you know that for yourself, that's what you get self-compassion from that. You start taking responsibility, just like you would with your food. People would respect you to see you make the effort to not cause your future suffering. It's self-respect, you know. And then that informs your ability to have compassion, because when you see that kid beat that other kid, you have the view of karma and you end up having compassion for both. You protect the child who's the victim from the other one. Yes, you do. But you know that you know that the other one was a victim in the past. You just change roles each life. So it's a very, very different view of compassion. Very different view. Because even now we do have compassion for poor people, and it's real compassion, or sick people or whatever. But there's implied some anger there. Who caused it, you know? And it's always something outside. That means the victim has to be innocent. And if you discover, like if you see me punch my boyfriend and then he punches me back, you will have compassion for neither of us. Well, you deserve it. So that's why we hear karma, we think, how can you have compassion? They deserve it. But these are concepts we've made up. It's a very different view, you know, very powerful. So when you begin to get this view and then apply it to others, then courageous, you know, the bodhisattvas, when you're really practicing compassion. Why also courageous? It's because it's not easy to have compassion for the pedophiles. The mother might. That pedophile's got a mum. She'll have compassion. But it's hard. And some of these practices are the more advanced level of the bodhisattva path, especially expressed in this text called the 8 Verses. You know, when you see troublemakers, harmers, evil, negative people causing terrible suffering, you will act like you've found this precious treasure. Why? Because they're grist for your mill, for you to cultivate incredible compassion. Because the Buddha's saying, as far as he's concerned, we're all in the same boat, causing our own suffering, having the capacity to cause our own happiness but not realizing it, and either causing our future suffering or experiencing the fruit of our past action. Yeah. So this is the basis of having real compassion for everybody. We're all in the same boat. And we can't have that without understanding the Buddhist teachings about the Four Noble Truths and karma, which is intense for us. So there are 2 main causes of suffering in the Four Noble Truths. One is, you know, well, how come I met that boyfriend in the first place? How come we bumped into each other? How come we have the relationship? How come he punches me or is indeed kind to me? That's due to our past history together, not just some accidental random event. So the other thing that plays a role once we're in that relationship is the second cause of suffering, and flip it over, the second causes of happiness, which is what in my mind. So the causes of my suffering are my delusions. And this is what we have to understand back in the wisdom wing. We have to understand Buddha's model of the mind. It's very clear, very specific, quite unique view of how the mind works. Buddhist psychology is quite unique. Now, you know, we know the words love, compassion, forgiveness, and generosity. And we know if we wanted to say, are they negative or positive? We know straight away they're in the positive. We know that. We call them that. Then you hear anger, depression, jealousy. You know they're in the other category called the unhappy states of mind, the neurotic states of mind. So Buddha describes these different states of mind, all the thousands of states of mind in our minds every day, in terms of 3 categories. They fit into 3 categories precisely. This is not how we think in our models of the mind. You've got the neurotic, deluded, afflicted, unhappy, I-based, fear-based states of mind that in their nature are the cause of my own suffering and pain and are why I harm others. And the root of those is called ego grasping, this primordial misconception of an intrinsic self that underpins everything else. That gives rise to the main delusion in daily life, effectively, as far as Buddha is concerned. That's called attachment. It's multifaceted. This emotional hunger this feeling of dissatisfaction, this emotional hunger that always wants something more, that is trying to fulfill the needs of the supposed I that we made up. It's intent, it's multifaceted, and it's the root of most of the other suffering in our daily lives. And then when that doesn't get what it wants, that attachment, this junkiness, that's the arising of these third of these so-called three poisons that Buddha refers to: anger, aversion. We run between these 1,000 times a day. They sound so simple to us: attachment, anger. They sound boring, you know. We make it so much more complicated, I'd say, in modern psychology. So the two main causes of my suffering at that moment, my boyfriend punches me in the nose. He is one of the causes, no question. But the first one answers the question, not why did my boyfriend punch me? And this is what's interesting. When you read any news reports of anybody who's just done some terrible murder or terrorism, the first thing we do is look into what happened to that person. Why is that guy killing people? What happened to him as a child? What did his mother do to him? What did the Catholic nuns do to him? We have to believe that he came into this life as an innocent victim, and then bad things happened to him that now cause him to go around shooting people. Well, Buddha's view is different. He brought those tendencies with him. He might have had a mum who should punch him in the nose as well. He might have, not every time. He brought those tendencies with him. So my boyfriend, there he is one of the causes of my suffering, but he's only a secondary cause. So the cause of why, so answering why my boyfriend punched me and gets angry by telling me that his mother must have punched him is not enough. It's enough to say, why did my boyfriend punch? But it's not enough even for the Buddha. It's because it's his own tendency. But it doesn't answer my question, hey, why me? And that's our main question. This is not answered by telling me why that terrorist did that because he's a terrorist because his mother hurt him. It doesn't say why me. We don't have an answer for why me. It's very fascinating. And that's the one that karma answers. Why me? Because I created the cause. Why happiness? Why the lottery? Why does one person even do one kind action to me? I must have had an action in the past that sowed the seed in my mind, and these conditions come together and a moment of happiness right. This is the logic of Buddha's teaching. This goes to incredible subtle depth, incredible subtle detail. Every millisecond of your experiences in life, you can either call them happiness or suffering. If you analyze it, it's like that. And if you tracked your day, one day, in terms of whether it was a happy moment or a suffering moment, you could have that one, wake up in the morning and very pleasant, because we would think, why will you have that pleasant moment at 11:10, Robina? Because my husband smiled at me. Why did you feel ugly at 2 in the afternoon? Because the red light was there and it got stuck at red for 10 minutes. So we'd always assume the external causes are the events that make me happy and suffer. But if we start to become involved in our own mind, then we're going to see moments of happiness and moments of suffering that are catalyzed by those external events. And each one of those moments of happiness is the fruit of a past virtue. Each one of those moments of suffering is the fruit of a past non-virtue. I mean, it's a very different view. This doesn't come naturally unless we study it. This is Buddha's teachings, We don't have to study them. But if you want to understand his basic principles of what is happiness and why are you happy and what is suffering and what are the causes, this is his explanations, nuts and bolts of Buddha's teaching. So all of this is the Four Noble Truths for you, and the result of this is your practice, which really is the application of the methods to help you have, it's the attitude of having compassion for yourself. Just like giving up sugar, which is painful, is the cause of your future happiness. But it's compassion for yourself, because you don't want future diabetes. So I don't want future suffering. That's why I have a life of ethics, which means I don't kill, I don't steal, I don't lie, and I live in vows. It's an action of self-compassion. That's the way to put it in Buddha's terms. And it informs my ability to have compassion for others, including the harmer. This is just the first level of suffering, when the bad things happen. And it's a very different view. I agree with you, very different. But this is Buddha's teachings, if you're interested in them. And it takes time to think it through and to apply them. Really hard for us. So why don't we have some questions? we're going to go through it. We're going to, the weekend, we'll go into the details of the practices of how to get compassion in the compassion wing part of the practices. You know, this is the first level. So are there any questions on Zoom or in person? Yes. It's a which? So I have an ethics question regarding that's perfect.
Can Zoom hear me? Somebody nod and
No, we cannot hear the question.
Okay, I'll have to repeat it then. I'll repeat your question. Go on, sweetheart. Tell us your question. Harmer and the harmed. It's an ethics question about the topic of having compassion for the harm and the harmed. Yeah, it's probably, I mean, you know, even in your mother's household, she had an ethical system. She had rules. So she would teach you, she's a good mother, that if you lie, sweetie pie, it'll harm you. But there's a rule in this house for your sake and the rest of us, because we live together, not to lie. And if you lie, I'm sorry, I'm going to be a bit punitive. She will punish you. Nothing wrong with that in a society to have kind of, because we're, you know, to have that. But the deeper point is, the deeper one is to see the suffering it causes you. And that's, if we really had that, that will be a powerful preventer. And I want to go into that a bit more. That's the key one. So there's nothing wrong with having a system of justice, but it would be based on compassion. So in other words, if you were a good judge and somebody who came into this life with a tendency to rape due to their past karma, and they'd be in front of you, you'd have compassion for this person. You'd know why they're raping, but you would also have to protect them from themselves and society. It's like a tough mother. You'd go to your room, Robina. I've told you 4 times, no more chocolate. It's out of compassion for me, because it's part of. So it's no contradiction at all. It doesn't mean there's going to be kind of anarchy. If karma is a natural law, why is it such a difficulty to be accepted by who? Oh, because because why it's difficult for us to accept, because the scientific view is not being rude. It's got amazing things. We mean by that the view of philosophical materialism, isn't it? That's why we all, and that is one of the views of the ego. Buddha says, we have that view already. Even if you never learned a word of science, even if you never learned a word about a creator, instinctively, we have the view of innocent victim, try to get ourselves off the hook and blame other people and deny responsibility. It's a function of the dualistic view of ego grasping, Buddha says. And that's what produces our philosophies. I mean, materialism isn't new. One of the many philosophical views back in India was materialism. It wasn't so prevalent. Now it prevails. And so, of course, karma is a nonsense view in the materialist view. It's a complete absurd nonsense. It's a complete fantasy, because you have to posit the continuity of consciousness in order to really get the view of karma properly. But my feeling is this, though, in order for us, I think the thing we really do miss as well, and forget, this is, you don't even need karma for this one. This is the point I was saying before. If you have a kind mother with no religion, but she's got ethics and she's got compassion, she will tell you that if you lie, sweetheart, it will harm you. And that's something even as Buddhists we miss out on, because we're trying to obey our vows and we feel guilty. So, hey, then we're waiting for someone to watch us do it, because we don't want to be found out. It's instinctive. So if we could really understand, you don't need karma for this one, that you're lying and you're stealing and you're killing and your anger and your anxiety and jealousy harm you, that brings accountability. I mean, this is what's so fascinating. I always tell this story. I worked with people in prison over the years. And there's one woman I met who's not a Buddhist, has no religious views. She talks about the universe, maybe. She's this hippie in the 70s, sunny. I've always talked about her. And that's I find it powerful because she has no particular religious views, you know. Never had, she's Jewish, but she had no religion really. In the 70s, she was hitching with her husband and their kids, and they got the two guys who picked them up got stopped by the police and killed the police, and then they got blamed. The hippies got blamed. So basically, her and her husband were on death row. The husband even got executed several years later, and she went to the execution, his head burst into flames. She lost her children. Her parents died. She's on death row for 12 years and in prison for 17 years. For many of those years in isolation, like the worst nightmare you could imagine. So now talk about innocent victim. You could say she had every right to go out of her brain with rage and despair. And that's how we think of it. When someone says, well, you know, okay, forget that. I'll take it in a second. So then she was she wrote a memoir, and she's a friend of mine. She lives in Ireland now. She's out of prison. She is this person who, the way I'd put it is, she didn't have much anger. She didn't have much blame mentality, but she had this incredible emotional intelligence to recognize, and this is how she saw it, that she knew she had the power to choose what to think and feel. And she knew she didn't want the pain of rage and despair. That's pretty intelligent, I tell you, because our feeling is that we have the right to be angry. And in other words, we don't see that it's harming us. And I always use this example. At the same time, I read about another fellow who also was innocent and who would be what we call normal, who did go out of his brain with rage and despair. He'd been accused of rape and murder, and he went completely out of his brain, screaming daily, as long as he had a voice, I did not rape and kill that woman. Now, if you'd said to him, well, sweetheart, you know, the Buddha says that you can change your mind and you don't need to be angry, he would think you're mentally ill. And this is how we all are. The feeling of anger and rage, they're like the innocent victim. We feel we have a right to be, and we say it. In other words, we just do not see that anger harms us. We think the other person harmed us, and they did. But we had, and that's what Sunny was saying. She knew she had the power. She has no religion. She has no views of karma. She has no view of it. I would just put she had this emotional intelligence to recognize that she had the power to be in charge of how she experienced her life. I mean, that's the thing that I think that our own delusions harm us. We know anger is painful, but we blame the person for making us angry. We know, I mean, look at anxiety and depression. They're overwhelming, but we always try to point to the thing out there to try to fix it. Somehow we don't, and I think that's the key thing in Buddhist psychology. He really, his expertise is the methodology to know your own mind and to change your mind, including anger, depression, anxiety, and everything else. That's the Buddhist practice. That's the expertise. Do you understand? By learning the introspection of how to identify your mind, having labels for, it's a very precise thing. I mean, we all know the feeling of anger, but we don't recognize that's just the tip of the iceberg that is rooted much more deeply in a conceptual story that we have practiced to perfection. That is the voice of how dare you do that to me, I don't deserve it. And it's quite subtle. So that's where developing the ability to learn to concentrate, meditation, is a skill we need to learn to help us dig deep down beneath the emotion. In our world, we look at the past to see why there's bad things happening. Buddha's skill is you down into your own mind, but ever more deep, to see the stories that form the emotions. And that's not the way we tend to think. Is the key to it. That's what it's all about. And man, what? You're saying it that way. I'm not saying it that way. And Buddha's not saying it that way either. Animal biology is just habit. We've all got it. It's just a habit of anger, the habit of jealousy, the instinct of grasping. They're just ancient mental habits. That's all they are. We've all got them. And we can learn to fundamentally unpack and unravel and deconstruct those habits to a degree of subtlety that does not exist in our modern psychology. Do you understand? So it absolutely is self-respect and self-compassion. I want to be less angry and less jealous. It's not punitive, but it's hard to hear about it because we want to blame. And that doesn't mean the person was right. The person did punch you. The person did rape you. Those people did accuse Sunny of murder. Do you understand? But and I can see it now, she doesn't, it's not that she suppressed her anger. And that's what we tend to feel. She simply doesn't have it because she worked on her own self, such powerful responsibility for her experiences every day and knew she was in charge. Do you understand? It's very fascinating. I have such respect for this woman. I can't get over it. And because she had no religion, so you can't blame the religious views, you know. Like I always use the example of these two young Tibetan nuns. And you say, well, that's just Buddhist, right? These young Tibetan nuns years ago in 2003, Richard Gere invited His Holiness to New York, Dalai Lama. And he also invited a bunch of former prisoners. So because I was working with people in prison, he invited a bunch of people like me as well. And there were 20 former prisoners, all of whom had done some kind of meditation in prison. And it was a very moving experience, talking about their suffering and the drama and the racism and all the business, right? And they met His Holiness. It was a wonderful time. But he also invited two young Tibetan nuns. So this is the point I'm getting at. These young women for whom this view of karma is exactly in their bones, just like materialism is in our bones. It's an absolute given. It's been in India for 5,000 years, for God's sake, or 3,000 years, you know, easily. This view is just the worldview. Just in the same way that materialism is our worldview, or Christianity for that matter, or maybe whatever, Judaism or whatever, for the creator concept. But for them, karma is in their bones and their being. And since they're born, that's part of their life. That's how they interpret the world. It's a very different way of seeing the world. So there they are, young women got arrested and got sexually abused and tortured in prison, which is not cool, right? So like Sunny, but they had the Buddhist view as their basis. They knew they had the power. They didn't have the power to get out of prison. Sunny knew that. She couldn't get out. And she was in a cell on her own for years. I mean, it's so heavy. This is this country, you know, it's so heavy, so punitive. You understand? So these young women had the view of Buddhism to deal with, I mean, they suffered terribly. Of course they did. But this is the way they interpreted it. So that was them, that informed their method of working with their practice. They saw it as purification. They learned to, and so at the end, they were telling their story and they were very quiet and there was no anger, not because they suppressed it, because they didn't have that view. So in other words, they didn't, if you analyze what anger is, this is so heavy for us. Basically, when you hear the thought of anger, what it's saying is outrage. How dare you do that to me? I don't deserve it. This is ego's view. Very fascinating. Well, they don't have that view because they have the view of karma. They don't have the view. It just doesn't arise in their mind. You've got to understand that. So for them, in the end, there were tears when they told their story. And one of them said very quietly, and of course, we had compassion for our torturers because we knew we must have harmed them in the past. That's the logic of karma. And we knew, especially this is the real reason for compassion, because we know they would suffer in the future as well. See, that's a real basis for compassion. Like the mother has that for her psychopath kid. Everybody can't stand him, but she's the one who knows he's harming himself. Do you understand? And that's the basis of compassion. So when you really have worked on your own mind and you see a person enraged, you get out of their way maybe, but you have such compassion for them because you see them right there, like they're stabbing themselves, they're harming themselves. And you cannot have that compassion until you see it yourself in your own mind about how your anger harms you, your jealousy harms you. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's intense, it's pretty intense stuff. And that's why the Sunny had this, for me, I call it emotional intelligence. She could see. She didn't want to go to that nightmare of hopelessness and be despair. And she knew she said, I knew I had the choice, she said. I mean, intense hard work. It wasn't like magic. Do you understand? I have such admiration. I can't get over her. I always tell this story. I can't get over her. And because there was no religion, the Buddhists, the nuns, you can say, oh, well, they're just Buddhists. That's how they are. But a Christian person, the same. A Christian, their view is different. Their view is, but it's another method. So I remember one conference we had years ago in San Francisco on happiness, and one of the groups was a couple. You know, I ran the thing, and there was a friend of mine in North Carolina who happens to be black, whose son was murdered, stabbed in a bar, and a woman who happened to be white, whose daughter was raped and murdered. And so they were discussing what's it called, that kind of justice? What's it called when you meet the victim? Huh?
It's restorative justice.
You meet each other and meet the victim and everything, which is marvelous, you know. So, and it was a very moving discussion, and each of them had their own view, right? So my friend, and I can't think of his name, it's old age, you do forget names when you get old, don't you? God, Andre, my friend, we worked together with people in prison in North Carolina. So his son got murdered that night, and he was on the news, on the television, you know, that night. And they said, how do you feel about the murderer of your son? And he was nearly in tears. He said, how can I not have compassion for him? His suffering is only just beginning. Now that's intense, isn't it? That he could see that. Because he works with young men in prison. And the mother, though, she became a Christian, and she wanted to meet the murderer of her daughter. And she met this young man, and he was so happy. And he was out of his brain. He was a white guy, out of his brain on drugs, you know, and he raped and killed her daughter. And he told the mother, she was 16, that before he murdered her, shot her in the head, she looked him in the eye and she said, I forgive you, and God does too. Now that's intense. So whatever view you have, it's something incredible, the method. I remember one time, this Muslim couple. So as to which is right or wrong, as to which is valid, is there a great or not, that's not discussion. Do you understand my point? So this Muslim couple in Malaysia, some flight had gone down and their daughter had been drowned in the flight, or killed in the flight. And so the news asked the couple, how do you feel about the death of your daughter? And they said, we are peaceful. She belongs to God and he has taken her back. Now, I would never criticize that view. I don't agree with it, but that caused them to have happiness and peace. That's pretty powerful. So in a way, it's proof, whether it's Sunny, Andre, the mother, or these couple, they've each got a different view. And it shows that a view is a thought. And you can work with thoughts to help you navigate and explain a situation that causes you to stay sane. Go for it, honey. You understand my point? As to which is right and valid, is real or not, that's another discussion. So I find that very powerful. So Andre was spontaneous. How could I not have compassion? His suffering is only just beginning. And it's true, you know. But because we're overwhelmed by rage and blame, you only want to see the bad. And you don't want to see anything good in a bad person, because then it makes you feel sorry, guilty. They've got to be a monster. You understand? That's why, if we can be brave enough to see our own suffering caused by our own anger, and then see our own good qualities, we won't have so much self-hate. You know? Be more respectful to ourselves. Because when we hate ourselves, we paint the whole of ourselves with that one brush of I'm a bad person. Because the key thing in Buddhist psychology is the delusions, they exaggerate. Anger exaggerates the badness. Guilt exaggerates your badness. You know, anxiety exaggerates the problems. It doesn't mean they can change overnight. It needs a lot of inner work, but we can. It's possible. That's the key Buddhist. You understand? This is the work you do on yourself. Then you have the basics of compassion for others. Then you can stay sane in life. Find a way to navigate the nightmare that life is, you know. Well, people, darling, what's the time? 1:15. I've still got New York time on. Oh, we've got 10 minutes to go. So any questions? People, more questions.
Venerable Robina, we have a question from David, and Terry and Aaron are in the room.
Good, darling.
Great.
In the room? Or in your room?
Three of them.
Zoom?
Yeah,
on the
there's
Zoom.
3 of them in one
Talk
room.
to me. What are the questions? Come on.
Hi, Venerable Robina. Nice to see you again. You kind of answered it before with some of the discussions you were just having. But
Hang on. Who's talking? I've got to see you.
David's
I can't
talking.
see you. Who's talking?
David.
I've got to see you, David. There you go. There you go, David. I see you, darling. Talk to me.
We'll keep it simple. You were talking about the red light bringing frustration and aversion.
Yes.
And then let's say I've got some mind training, and the next time I see the red light, doesn't cause that frustration or aversion. And like I said, you kind of covered this already. I guess I'm just curious if it were how that relates to like a karmic imprint, or if it was
How what, David?
How me responding to something that could cause agitation, whether it's a human or not.
Yep.
What that does for my karmic imprint.
Oh,
because you
I
said
mean, okay,
the
yeah,
red light is a
exactly. No,
catalyst.
I mean, if you and I are partners, and you're, just mild things, you slurp your coffee too loud, and I start to get annoyed with you, and it can be very small things. We know that in relationships. You don't have to try and murder me for me to be upset with you. So, if I grab my mind before the words come out the mouth, and just kind of, and one of the ways, either I practice shut up, Robina, give the man a break, let him slurp his coffee. Another method is, and this is more difficult, is to try and see it as a good sound, and try and change my interpretation of it. The red light, you can just change your interpretation. Give it a break, Robina. Red's a nice color. Relax. It's only about a minute. You reinterpret the red light. So you reinterpret. Basically, anger's saying it's ugly, it shouldn't be happening, and how dare it. That's very fixed. So you change the interpretation of it. That's all Sunny did, and you practice changing your interpretation. So if I do that every morning, then before I know it, your slurping just won't seem ugly anymore. So it also changes your karmic input. Of course it does, because you're radically purifying your tendency to be angry. And therefore, eventually, which would ripen, in my case with you, if I got so mad, I'd come punch you in the nose one day. So it would stop so many problems. It's radically good to change your view, and it changes your karmic imprints, and it purifies your habits. Absolutely.
It purifies the habit. I always thought purification referred to the imprints, but you just said purification.
Say that again. I'm only hearing you from a distance. I can't hear you from my computer, you see.
How is this any better?
Yeah, go on.
My understanding was that purification was of imprints, but you just said you could purify a habit as well.
Oh, that's what all it means. You're purifying the habit. Every time you stop doing it, you're changing that habit, aren't you? So you're purifying the tendency to keep doing it. That's, of course, what you're doing. And you're purifying the past, because it's all connected, So it's just like playing the piano, and you play the piano wrong all the time. Every time you make the effort to change the habit to play the right piano, you're changing the whole scenario. You're radically reprogramming your mind, aren't you?
Makes sense.
Are we communicating?
Yep, makes sense.
Good, David. Who
Thank
else? Mary?
Donnie, did you have a question earlier in the chat?
Did you say Donnie? Absolutely not.
Who's got a question?
No, nobody venerable.
Nobody. Okay. Huh? Who? Oh, yes, sweetheart. Talk to me. Yeah, I think it's a good way to put it, self-preservation. Okay. Yeah. So I'll use this example I always tell of Lama Zopa Rinpoche when he nearly drowned as a little boy. He tells the story himself. So Lama Zopa, you might or might not know, but he was considered to be the reincarnation of a previous yogi. And so clearly he came, if this is true, he came into this life with realizations of emptiness. He'd cut ego grasping. He'd cut the neuroses. He didn't, and that means you don't have fear and attachment. You've gone past all that. So let's just take that as a given. Because when he was 8, he tells the story, it was about 1952 or something. He was in Nepal up in the mountains, and he saw a big river. And on the other side of the river were these weird looking people. And they were white people. These had pale colored eyes. Their eyes were pale colored. It's a weird idea, isn't it? And they had straw colored hair. You see, they sound like Swedish people, don't they? So anyway, he wanted to meet them. He'd never met white people before. So he managed to get across the river in those rickety bridges with his bowl of potatoes as a gift. But he fell in the water. Of course, they don't teach them swimming up there. And these waters are pretty torrential, pretty tumultuous, those rivers. So he's looking like he's drowning. This poor manager, this monk who's supposed to take care of his little tulku, having a panic attack, no doubt. And so this is how Lama Zopa told the story. It's very powerful. He's 8, right? And he said, the head came to the surface for air. Now, this is a whole background to that. When you learn all the teachings about emptiness and about how to look for the I and all this, you learn to sort of have this very objective way of just talking about the I. That even in ordinary world, in the Buddha's view, you don't talk about my anger, I'm angry, I'm jealous. You talk about anger, jealousy. You see them as very objective, which is very powerful. And so the head, not my I came to the surface for air. No, the head went to the surface. Sounds weird, but it's very powerful. And he saw his manager having a panic attack running along the bank. He's going to lose this little Rinpoche. Anyway, he then said, aha, the thought occurred to me that the person known as the Laudo Lama, he was recognized as a little boy as the reincarnation of the Laudo Lama. He said, the thought occurred to me, the person known as the Laudo Lama is about to die. So even that is very objective. And that's the way when you learn this type of, the teachings, that's how they talk, to get past this constant identification, this fear-driven I, So he then said, I didn't know anything about emptiness, but there was no fear. Now, this is the point. I think, wasn't it Mr. Darwin who even named it instinct for survival? I don't know, is it Mr. Darwin who talked about instinct for survival? And it's either flight and that kind of business. So what that is in Buddhist terms is the root delusion called ego grasping, which is this primordial belief in an intrinsic, real, solid me. This is the most advanced level in Buddhist psychological teachings. So we have that deep instinctive belief. So that really is what the world calls self-preservation. And we assume it's natural. And we even assume, because everybody's got it, that you wouldn't manage without it. We, in fact, believe if you didn't have that, Lama Zopa would just sink to the bottom of the river like a stone. So we think it's ego grasping and fear and panic and instinct for survival that caused him to try to survive. No, in fact, the Buddha would say when you cut all the delusions, he's not stupid. He sees he's drowning, and it's a reasonable thing to want to get out of the water, but his mind wouldn't have been disturbed. He would have, if he had drowned, he wouldn't have had fear. He didn't have fear. He said there was no fear. So instinct for survival is really what Buddha calls ego grasping, which causes you to panic when something goes wrong. Forget about being held up by a gun. Forget about drowning. Even when someone accuses of something, we have a panic attack. We're in constant survival mode, which is defending me, I, as opposed to you. And they say when you finally realize emptiness, there's no longer a separate sense of I. There's no longer a sense of other, because your mind is so blissful and connected to others and so much compassion. So the whole philosophy of this belief in a separate I, which we assume is a natural given in our world, which is the very thing that Buddha questions most, is the root of all our suffering. Attachment is what comes as a result to get what that fantasy I wants, when the panic attack of anger, when it doesn't get what it wants, and all the other delusions come after that. There's a whole analysis of them. They're all nonsense. We've got them, they're real, but we can remove them. They're not at the core of our being. Are we communicating? And this is why we suffer. This is the source of our suffering. So we're constantly supporting the I, trying to uphold the I. And it doesn't mean you have self-hate. It's not that at all. It's the wrong sense of I, which is fear-based and panic-stricken and demented and miserable. And that's what our suffering is. And when you've lessened the grip of that sense of I, you only have joy and fulfillment and more virtue and more love and more compassion and less suffering and more self-respect. Do you understand? That's really, in ordinary words, is what the Buddhist path is about. What, darling? Yeah, that's right. If you like, it's exactly right. So in other words, giving up these delusions is a very powerful, courageous practice, because you learn to face the problem, not freak out and resist it. Because attachment is this emotion. Attachment is the main voice of ego grasping, this root delusion. And attachment is this emotional hunger that never feels I have enough, never feels I am enough. So it's always hankering after something. It always wants only the nice things. It only wants nice experiences. It only wants nice tastes, nice smells, nice words, nice everything. It can't cope with problems. And the millisecond attachment doesn't get what it wants, the red light, the annoying husband, attachment has a panic attack and aversion arises. And if it's really volatile, it becomes anger. And if it's suppressed, it builds up as depression. Look at the world. We run between this attachment and anger. So learning to be brave, to face the problem, like reinterpret the slurp, reinterpret the red. That's exactly what Sunny did in prison in the most dramatic way. And she was the beneficiary. It wasn't being holy, it was being intelligent. It's tough work. Time to go home, I think. This is the basis of self-compassion, put it that way. Now we can start to see why others are, and the more we know our own mind, the more empathy we can have for the craziness of the suffering human world. And then have the courageous compassion. What can I do to help? What can I do to help? So compassion is, oh my God, look at the suffering. And then there's another level of compassion. It's like a technical term, great compassion, mahakaruna in Sanskrit. And that's the brave one of saying, what can I do to help? But you really, it's an action one. That's really powerful. So the more you know your own suffering and the causes of it, that informs your ability to see the suffering of the world. Do you understand? You can't, and this is why, and we'll go into this in more in detail on the weekend, a lot of us have a lot of compassion, but why we get exhausted and drained. And look at the number of people, those kind nurses and health workers who killed themselves because they couldn't handle the pain. So and this is where this sounds again very cruel in a way. We don't suffer because we have compassion. We don't suffer because there's suffering out there. We suffer because our attachment can't handle it. Our aversion can't handle it. But if you've worked on your own mind and become less attached and less angry, you have incredible courage and you're not dragged down by the world. You do what you can, but it doesn't drag you down. That's what courageous compassion would be. And that comes from working on your own mind. We'll go into this in the weekend. All right, people? Good enough for tonight. Food for thought. Thank you, Betty. Happy to see you, darling. Okay, we finish with another little prayer. Just thinking, may compassion grow. I'll sing in Tibetan. May compassion grow and grow in the hearts of all. And then the seeds we've just planted, this 90 minutes, it's gone like a dream, hasn't it? So quick. And the Buddha would say there's nothing that goes astray. Everything is left in our mind. Everything's stored there in our memory. And these seeds we've planted. So I have this view of seeds we've planted by listening. So think we're going to nourish these seeds from this moment forward with our own efforts, our own practice, so that we can never give up working on ourselves, so we can be a benefit to others. We'll just sing the two little prayers in Tibetan. Gewadi Nyududan Lama Sange Drugyurne Drowa Chikyan Malupa Jai Sala Gopasho Jang Chub Sem Chog Rinpoche Ma Ke Panam Ke Gyochig Ke Panyampa Me Payang Gong Ne Gong Du Avasho. Okie doke. Thank you. See some of you tomorrow, some not, whatever. Meanwhile, keep moving, never give up. Okay. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, darlings. Thank you, everybody on the television screen. See some of you tomorrow again, hopefully. And if not, Sunday as well. Bye, darlings.